Most people at Franklin Public High in Philadelphia knew William Kramer only as Mr. Bill, the elderly janitor who arrived before the sun rose, swept the hallways with slow, deliberate steps, and left long after the last bell echoed down the now empty corridors. He wore the same navy blue cardigan every day, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, and his silence was part of the building itself, like the creaking floors or the clock in the main office that always ran 3 minutes late. No one ever asked about his past. No one thought to. He was simply the man with the mop, the one who nodded but rarely spoke, whose hands were always busy but whose eyes seemed to drift elsewhere, as if still watching something unfold in another time, another place. What the students didn't know, what even the principal didn't know, was that locked in a dented green metal cabinet in the boiler room sat a wooden box. Inside it, bound with a faded silk ribbon, were dozens of letters, each one handwritten, each one addressed to the same name, Sarah Adler. Sarah, a name never spoken aloud in that school, a name written over and over again in careful, trembling cursive on paper that had long since yellowed with age. She had once lived in Brooklyn, the daughter of a German Jewish baker. William met her in 1943 during his OSS training before being deployed to Europe. She worked with a refugee aid organization. He trained in covert operations. They weren't supposed to fall in love, but war doesn't follow rules. They made a promise before he left for Europe. He would return and she would wait. They exchanged just a few letters. Then silence. He wrote, but received no reply. Still, he kept writing. Through the war, through France, through the forests of Belgium and the ruins of Germany. He wrote as bombs fell. He wrote in foxholes. He wrote in hospital beds. The war ended, but he never found her again. Friends said she had been deported. Others said she'd fled west. The letters, unsent, became his only tether to what was real and what had been lost. He came back to the United States in 1946, alone, changed. He took jobs where people didn't ask questions. Eventually, he ended up at the school in Philadelphia. He stayed, he swept, he locked his past behind a boiler room door. Everything might have stayed that way, had it not been for a curious 11th grader named Jake. In 1992, as part of a school project on local veterans, Jake accessed newly digitized military archives at the public library. Scrolling through old OSS records, he stumbled upon a name listed in several intelligence missions in France, credited with aiding resistance cells and smuggling out civilians from occupied zones. Kramer, William A., Philadelphia, OSS, status unconfirmed. Jake blinked. That couldn't be Mr. Bill. He printed the page, and the next morning he stood outside the janitor's office, paper in hand, and asked the question no one had ever dared to ask. "Mr. Bill, is this you?" The old man didn't answer, but his hand trembled out just once, and in his eyes something shifted, not fear, not denial, just memory and a grief long held in silence. If this story touches you the way it touched me while writing it, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing real stories that move, inspire, and reveal what time almost buried. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. The following week, something shifted. Not just in Jake, but in the very atmosphere of Franklin High, as though the walls, the lockers, the old oak floors beneath the linoleum tiles sensed that one of their oldest ghosts was being disturbed. Jake, who had never thought much of Mr. Bill before, now found himself watching the janitor more closely, noting the way his steps echoed a little too softly, the way his shoulders seemed to carry weight that had nothing to do with age or mop buckets. The paper he had printed from the archive, listing William A. Kramer as a former OSS operative, sat folded in the front pocket of his school binder like a secret waiting to be acknowledged. But Jake didn't confront him again, not right away. Instead, he dug deeper. He returned to the city's public archives, where a retired historian, amused by the boy's curiosity, showed him how to access the unclassified military personnel files, many of which had only recently been released after decades under lock and key. There, he found more than he expected: field reports from occupied France, mentions of a Kramer known to work under aliases, supporting local resistance cells, smuggling out documents and people under the noses of the Gestapo. In one typed dispatch dated March 1945, a field officer described Agent WK as an American with excellent German, calm under pressure and impossible to forget once you've worked beside him. Jake printed that too. And then came the name that made his chest tighten: Sarah Adler. In a separate report, unrelated to OSS records but found in the archives of the War Refugee Board, there was mention of a Sarah Adler, German-born, Jewish, evacuated from Berlin in 1939, active in humanitarian aid efforts in New York, then in Boston. It was noted that she ceased correspondence after 1944 and was presumed to have left the country, destination unknown. It couldn't be a coincidence. Jake remembered the name from the military record folder, the letters, addressed to a Sarah Adler. He hadn't seen them, but he'd heard stories from teachers about how Mr. Bill kept to himself, never married, never spoke of family. There was something sacred in that silence, not bitter, just enduring. Finally, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, when the last bell had rung and the halls had begun to empty, Jake returned to the boiler room. The door was open. Mr. Bill was sitting on a wooden stool, tightening the handle on a mop with a wrench. The room smelled of old paper and machine oil. There was a calm in the air, but it was heavy, as though time itself sat in the corner watching. Jake stepped in. He didn't speak right away. He simply pulled out the document from his binder, the one with the name, the date, the code, WK, and set it down gently on the nearby workbench. William Kramer didn't look at the paper. He didn't need to. Instead, he wiped his hands on an old cloth, stood up slowly and, after a long moment of stillness, walked over to a metal cabinet in the far corner of the room, the one with the dented door and the rusted handle. He unlocked it. Jake said nothing. He knew enough not to speak. Mr. Bill pulled out a small wooden box, aged, scratched, tied shut with a piece of what looked like silk ribbon. He set it down on the bench alongside the file Jake had brought. "You found me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement, a release. Jake nodded, unsure what to say. He felt young, too young, but also old, as though he'd stumbled into a memory that didn't belong to him, but had chosen him anyway. William opened the box. Inside, letters. Dozens, neatly stacked, dated, organized, some on army stationery, others on scraps of whatever paper had been available. One on the back of a ration card, another on a page torn from a German schoolbook, each addressed to Sarah Adler, each signed, carefully, W. He took one out, he unfolded it, and began to read aloud, not to Jake, not to the room, but to someone who, despite everything, still lived somewhere in the spaces between the words. "Sarah, I saw a little girl today in a bombed village. She looked like you might have when you were 10. She had dirt on her face and no shoes, but she offered me a piece of bread she'd been saving. I didn't take it. I couldn't. It felt like stealing from the last part of the world that still believed in kindness. I thought of your hands, how they trembled the last time you touched mine. I carry that moment in my chest like a match I haven't struck yet. If this letter finds you, please know I still write because somewhere I hope you still exist." When he finished reading, William didn't speak again. He simply put the letter back in the box and tied the ribbon with hands no longer shaking. Jake stayed there a while, then left. Nothing more was said that day, but something had changed. The silence had broken, and beyond the sound of janitor's keys and school bells, something older had stirred. a truth once buried, now beginning to breathe again. Before William Kramer was the janitor at Franklin High, before he was Mr. Bill, the quiet man with calloused hands and heavy steps, he was just a boy from South Philadelphia who lied about his age to enlist early, desperate not for glory, but for meaning. It was 1943, and the world was unraveling. He'd seen the newsreels, the photos, the names printed in the obituaries of boys he used to play ball with. He wanted to do something that mattered, not out of heroism, but out of instinct. Something in him refused to be passive while the world burned. That was how he ended up in Virginia, training with the OSS, the United States' newly formed Office of Strategic Services, where his knack for languages, inherited from his German-born grandfather, and his quiet, observant nature, made him a natural choice for covert work. He learned to move silently, to disappear in plain sight, to forge documents and carry secrets in his head like they were just another heartbeat. That was also where he met Sarah Adler. She wasn't part of the agency. She was part of something else, a volunteer translator with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, helping German Jewish refugees find their way in the chaos of war. Her father had been a baker in Brooklyn, her mother a schoolteacher. She had sharp eyes, a voice like slow rain, and a way of speaking that made you feel like nothing was beyond understanding or forgiveness. They met at a transport checkpoint. She was helping relocate a family. He was headed out on assignment. She handed him a map by mistake. He handed it back. Their hands touched, and neither forgot. They met again and again. A few stolen weekends, a few letters. The war didn't allow for more. Before he left for France, he told her, "If I make it through, I'll come find you." "I'll wait," she said. "Write me," he added. "Always." He did, from Paris, from the Ardennes, from villages with names he could barely pronounce. He wrote between assignments, during night watches, after firefights, under candlelight. He wrote not just about what he saw, but about what he remembered. The way her voice softened when she spoke Yiddish to children, the way she twisted her hair when thinking, the smell of flour that always seemed to follow her like a shadow. "Sarah, today we found a barn full of stolen art. Paintings, tapestries, music sheets, the things people died trying to protect. I kept thinking, why are some things saved and others not? I have nothing left from you, but your voice is the only thing that keeps me human." The letters piled up. He had no address, no idea where she was. At first, he sent them to her old job in New York. No reply. Then he wrote anyway, for himself, to remember, to feel, to survive. In early 1945, his unit helped liberate a small town near the German border. They found women and children in hiding, starving, frightened beyond language. He asked one of them her name. She said, Adler. His heart stopped. But it wasn't her, just a coincidence, or maybe a sign. When the war ended, William didn't go home right away. He stayed, helped rebuild, helped bury, helped translate final letters for families who would never receive answers. He asked about her, in embassies, churches, consulates. No trace. It was as if she'd vanished, a breath exhaled into a world too broken to listen. By the time he returned to the US in 1946, he was quieter, thinner, older in the way that doesn't show on the face, but lives behind the eyes. He kept the letters, packed them in the wooden box he had carved himself from scrap during downtime in Bavaria. He thought about delivering them to her family. But the bakery in Brooklyn had closed. The street had changed, names forgotten or erased. He took a job as a custodian at a warehouse, then at a community center, then eventually at the school. Always places where people moved on, where no one stayed long enough to ask questions. He liked the rhythm, the silence. He liked the sound of footsteps that weren't marching. And still, he wrote, even in the 60s, the 70s, when the world changed around him, when the war became textbooks and speeches, and the names on memorials were polished but untouched, he wrote, Sarah, I dreamed about you last night. You were on a train, waving, and I was running beside it. I couldn't catch up. I woke up before you disappeared. I think that's what time does. It lets you see people just long enough to lose them again. He never knew if she was alive, married, gone. All he had were questions and the steady, stubborn ritual of writing into silence. Until that afternoon, in the boiler room, when silence cracked, and he opened the box, not just for Jake, but for himself. And yet, somewhere far beyond that school, across oceans and decades, another letter waited, a reply that had never found its way until now. There are places in America, quiet places, overlooked and worn smooth by time, where history doesn't shout, it whispers. The old brick building that housed Franklin Public High in northeast Philadelphia was one of them. A place where linoleum peeled at the corners, where radiators hissed with every winter, and where the past seemed to sit just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to listen. Jake, now fully immersed in William Kramer's story, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, not just about the man, but about the school itself. The deeper he looked into William's history, the more he began to sense that the building in which he worked wasn't just a backdrop to the story, it was part of it. It began with a line in an old city property record, found in the dusty back corner of the municipal archives during a late Saturday visit. A line typed faintly at the bottom of a deed. Site of former synagogue. Structure destroyed 1947, replaced by municipal school construction. Jake blinked. He reread it. This school, the one he walked through every day, had been built on top of a synagogue. Not just any building, but a place of worship. A place where people had once gathered in prayer, in fear, in hope. A place that had belonged to families, to names, to songs no longer sung. He pulled more records. The synagogue had served German and Eastern European Jewish immigrants from the early 1900s through the war. Sarah Adler's family name appeared in a community registry dated 1936. Her father, Jacob Adler, a baker, had been a congregant known for donating bread to the poor during the Depression. Jake sat with this knowledge for days, unsure what it meant. But it explained something. Why William had never left, why he had stayed in this one building year after year, as if tending a grave no one else could see. He approached his history teacher, Ms. Rosen, a woman in her 60s, known for keeping photos of her own grandparents' immigration from Hungary pinned to the bulletin board. She listened carefully as Jake recounted what he'd found. William's past, the letters, the records, the synagogue. When he finished, she didn't speak right away. Then she said softly, "There's a reason why stories hide, Jake. Sometimes they're waiting for someone young enough not to be afraid of them." Together, they contacted the Jewish Historical Society of Pennsylvania. At first, it was routine, old membership logs, archival correspondence, photographs. Then, during a follow-up call with a researcher, came the question that changed everything. "You said the name was Sarah Adler." "Yes," Jake answered, suddenly tense. There was a pause. "We have a donor file. Someone by that name submitted materials in 1989. Are you related?" "No," Jake said quickly. "But I think I know someone who was." The box had been small, donated by a woman in her early 60s who identified herself only as Sarah's daughter. She had said her mother passed away a few months earlier in New Jersey, and that she had asked for these materials to be preserved not as public exhibits, but as quiet memory. Inside were a few letters, a passport, a photograph of a young man in uniform, and one final envelope, sealed, yellowing, addressed in looping cursive, "To William Kramer. If found, please deliver." Jake felt the breath leave his chest. He asked for a scanned copy. He signed the necessary forms. He paid the small processing fee with the contents of his college savings jar. And then he printed the letter, carefully, reverently, folding it once, placing it in a fresh envelope, and walking back to the school. This time, there was no knocking. He found Mr. Bill where he always was in the late afternoon, in the boiler room, checking the pressure gauge, wiping tools clean as though the building depended on his touch to remain upright. Jake stood in the doorway, held out the envelope with both hands. William turned. He looked at it, his eyes fixed on the handwriting. He didn't speak. His fingers trembled, not like the first time, but differently, as if something inside him had stopped resisting and simply let go. He sat down on the wooden stool, the letter in his lap. Jake backed away without a word, letting the moment remain untouched. Outside, the school hallway was quiet. But behind that old green door, a truth 60 years delayed had just arrived, not in the form of confession, but of affirmation. Some loves end in silence, others arrive as in the form of paper, ink, and the echo of a name once whispered, now finally heard. The envelope, resting quietly in William's lap as the light from the boiler room flickered against the chipped concrete walls, felt not like paper and ink, but like the embodiment of decades of waiting, decades of wondering, of writing without reply, of carrying a name in his chest like a heartbeat that never slowed, even when he had long given up hope of ever hearing it spoken again. And now, with trembling fingers and breath held still between memory and disbelief, he opened it, not as a man opening a letter, but as a man opening a door to a life he had locked away, convinced it had been sealed by time forever. He unfolded the pages slowly, reverently, as if they might vanish with the air, and as he scanned the handwriting, so familiar, so impossibly unchanged by the decades, the room around him seemed to fall away, leaving only the space between her words and his soul. My dearest William, if you are reading this, then somehow, against all odds, the world has allowed my voice to find you again, not in person, not in time, but in truth, which is all I ever hoped would remain. I do not know whether you are alive, whether you are well, whether you have forgotten me or kept me somewhere safe in a corner of your heart, as I have kept you. Quietly, fiercely, without permission from the world, but with absolute devotion from the part of me that was always yours. I waited, William, longer than I ever thought possible, through silence, through wars, through years of searching faces on every crowded street, hoping yours might appear like a ghost breaking through fog. And even after others told me you had surely died, even after I built a life with someone else, I kept a part of me wrapped around the memory of you, because there was no other shape that ever fit so perfectly into the idea of what it meant to be seen and known and loved. I wrote too for years, to addresses that no longer existed, to military officers who sent back silence, to fate itself, until the letters became prayers, and the prayers became thoughts, and the thoughts became part of the way I breathed. I wanted to tell you that I lived, and that it wasn't always easy, and that the love you gave me, brief as it was, carried me further than I ever imagined, through motherhood, through grief, through the joy of watching my children grow, through the quiet evenings when your name would rise again like a candle in the dark, soft and warm and still waiting. I never blamed you. I never stopped believing you were real. And if you are holding this letter, know that I wrote it not to ask for anything, not to reopen old wounds, but to give you back the truth you gave me, that what we had was not imagined, not romanticized, not a casualty of war, but something living, something that somehow still is. Thank you, William, for everything. For your courage, for your kindness, for the letters I never received but always felt. Yours, always, Sarah. When he finished reading, William remained motionless, not because the words had stunned him, but because they had returned something he thought he had lost completely. Not just Sarah, not just the past, but the part of himself that had written those letters from muddy fields and crowded bunkers and lonely hospital beds, believing, against reason, that someone out there was still listening. He closed his eyes, not to forget, but to see more clearly, to remember her laugh, the light in her eyes, the way her hands moved when she read aloud, the scent of her hair in the rain-soaked evenings of their youth, and the sound of her voice when she said, Promise me you'll write, because even now, even in this quiet, she was there, not as a ghost, but as a presence finally given shape through. Oh, the grace of paper and ink and love that refused to die. The tears came not like a flood, but like a prayer, one slow drop after another, each a page turned in a story he thought had ended long ago, but which now, with this letter, found its final chapter, not in sorrow, but in the peace of knowing that love, when true, doesn't fade, but waits patiently until time allows it to speak again. And when he stood at last, placing the letter gently back in its envelope, smoothing its folds with care, he did so not as a broken man, but as someone restored. Not because the years had been kind, but because her words had endured, and in enduring, they had healed something deeper than even he had understood was wounded. William Kramer didn't return to work the following Monday, nor the Monday after that. There was no announcement, no farewell assembly, no formal goodbye, just an empty boiler room, a set of neatly hung tools, and a folded grey cardigan draped over the back of a chair, as though he had simply stepped outside for a moment and might return any minute. Keys jangling softly, sleeves rolled up, ready to fix whatever the day had broken. But he didn't return. In his absence, something shifted in the hallways of Franklin High, not in volume or routine, but in awareness. Students paused longer by the bulletin board where the photo still hung. The young man in a military uniform, arm wrapped around the woman with the kind smile and wind-swept hair. Beneath them, the note remained untouched. She waited, he remembered, and their love survived them both. Teachers began using his story, first quietly, then openly, to teach lessons not only about the war, but about love, loss, silence, and the invisible weight of history. Some students brought in stories from their own families, about letters tucked into shoeboxes, about names engraved on medals or etched into fading tombstones. What William had hidden for so long now lived in the voices of children who had never known him, but who, somehow, understood him. Jake, now a senior, donated the scanned copies of the letters and Sarah's final message to the local historical society. They were archived under the title Correspondence between William Kramer and Sarah Adler, 1943-1987, a testimony of waiting. The wooden box, now empty, was given to the school, placed in a glass case outside the library, beside a plaque that read, "In memory of those who wrote not to be heard, but to remember." And yet, William's story didn't end in a hallway or a file or a framed photo. Every Saturday morning after his quiet retirement, he had walked to a memorial park a few blocks from the school, where a modest bronze plaque honored the city's World War II veterans, most of them long gone, many unknown. There, on the same bench, under the same tree, he sat with a single white lily in his lap and a letter in his hand, sometimes reading it, sometimes not. But always, always carrying it. When he passed, quietly in sleep, just weeks after his final visit to the memorial, he left no immediate family behind, no will, no list of possessions, only a note sealed in a blank envelope, marked in careful, fading cursive for the ones who still believe in words. Inside, Sarah's final letter, carefully preserved, her words, his silence. Now, one. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please like, share, and subscribe. We bring you new stories every day, real stories that live on in memory, in letters, and in love that time could never erase.